You're listening to Music Mythology. My name is Sam Romo, and let's talk about some music.
Everybody?
Sure.
Awesome. All right. Okay. 1, 2, 3. All right. So, first pilot, here we are. So, yeah. I'm excited because, Dad, I know you've been a long time fan of Buffalo Springfield. I've only really gotten into him probably in the last, year or so. Especially after watching Echo in the Canyon. It was a very eye-opening to the beginnings of a lot of those bands and realizing that they were a super group without being a super group, right? They had become something really phenomenal in like Whiskey a Go-Go, just in their own time. But then post Buffalo Springfield, they just exploded in all these different groups. And at this point, they were kind of the best competitor against like the Beatles, like UK versus America music output. You know, you had the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield, and you had the Beatles, and they were both kind of ripping off of each other or riffing off of each other. But their beginning's really interesting. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Dad.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say one of the most interesting parts of their beginnings is that so two of them are Canadian. Well, I guess let's start with the members, who the members were. So you had Neil Young, Stephen Stills, both guitarists and singers. I think Stills played the piano. So let's see, what else? Dewey Martin on the drums, Bruce Palmer on the bass, and Bruce Palmer was Neil Young's cohort from Canada. So they were the Canadians. And then you had Furay, or is it Furay or Fury?
I think it's Fury.
Okay. His first name is Richard, right?
Yeah, Richie.
And then eventually Messina, and was he
Jim Messina.
Was he a guitarist?
I think he might have been rhythm, yeah.
Okay. Well, you had, so you had the very beginning would have been really interesting because they meet each other in 65 in Canada. Stephen Stills and Neil Young, that is. And Stills, had told him that he's moving to Laurel Canyon, and that's where he's going to be, trying to make it with his current group, which he wasn't the lead in. He was just a guitarist. And at the time, Neil Young was in kind of the same bag. Well, I guess that's not true. He was with the Squires, which was just a duo. It was him and another guy. I can't remember the other guy's name. But they had been doing it for years. I think at that point it was like 3 years. And it was like 63, 64. Then they wind up meeting a Motown producer through Palmer. Palmer is the bassist for the Birds. I'm sorry, I'm overlapping myself. So Neil Young, that's how he meets Palmer, is their fellow musicians. And he's currently the bassist for the Birds, which was led by, he didn't go by Rick James at the time, but he would eventually become Rick James. So he was the lead singer of the Birds out of Canada. And they went on to only get 3 singles, I think, through Motown. They never had a record finished because as they started to work on it, the U.S. Navy caught Rick James because he had gone AWOL from the Navy. And so when they found him, they the production label was real weird, hands off. They didn't want to do, they couldn't control it. They didn't know where he was going to go and what was going to happen. So he was too chaotic. They didn't know what was going to happen. But they had just bought the studio, the label had just invested in equipment for the entire band. So Neil Young got an electric guitar that he had never had before. They had electric amps that they didn't have before. They were all acoustic. And so since they were over it and they didn't know what was going to happen, but they had met Stephen Stills and heard about the future, of folk music and rock music in America and California, they sell the equipment without telling the label, take that money and buy tickets to go to America. And then they buy a hearse, and that's where Neil Young gets his hearse to carry their equipment. And then that comes to the legendary story of them coming to Laurel Canyon looking for Stephen Stills. This is early 60s, so you don't, he's not in the phone book. You're not going to find him. So who knows how you're going to find him? You got to go to Whiskey a Go-Go or whatever kind of venue down there he would be around. But the legend goes is that they're driving in the hearse, and it's a hearse. It's like, and I think it was a weird color. I can't remember what it looked like, but it stands out. It's not a regular car. And so as they're driving through, they literally pass Stephen Stills on the road through Laurel Canyon or through LA, whatever. And they see each other, and I imagine it's because, I don't know about y'all, but if I see a hearse most time, I look at it, and then if you see two dudes driving it, and then you know them, and then of course you'd probably stop because you'd realize, oh crap, look, it's that dude. But yeah, so they meet, and then that's the beginning. And then, now we can get into their albums, I guess, because that's what's the most interesting part. And eventually, I'll just touch on this really quick. I also read that eventually that dealing of selling the equipment from the Motown label caught up to Neil, because it was Neil's idea. And the label actually put they reached out to the banks that he was with, and they asked him to put a lien on some of his dealings until he paid it back. So they went full legal on him and could prove that, we gave you this equipment and you sold it without telling anyone. It wasn't technically your equipment. It was the studio's equipment.
So they had him for the whole equipment? Like how much money are we talking about?
I don't know. But at that point, it would have been, I assume they would have added interest, because I don't think it happened till like the 80s or the 70s. It took a while. But that was just like a little side story that it caught up to him. He had to pay it back. I'm sure he already had enough money to where it wasn't a problem, but I just thought that was kind of funny that he didn't just like up and go on his own accord. He used the studio a little bit to leverage him to get a ticket over there selling their stuff.
I'm sure that wasn't the first that was the first of many times where he would be chased after legally for something he did.
Oh, I'm sure. But you have them starting out, and I think their first single, officially underneath the name Buffalo Springfield, which they got that name from a steamroller.
Oh, yeah.
They're another thing they were just hanging out, and then they saw it and they liked the name and thought it would be different. I think they actually went by the Buffalo Springfield in the beginning, and then they dropped the, like Facebook. It always does sound better. But anyways, so then I guess their first technical single is Nowadays Clancy Can't Dance, or Can't Sing. I'm sorry, Can't Sing. And that's a really good song. Off that first album, I love that track. Obviously, For What It's Worth became a huge protest song and it's a big part of that time, that era, talking about all the unease, I guess, of American society and balancing war and all these changes in culture, and the change of music is just a very, I don't know, how would you describe that song?
Yeah, you said that it really is, a lot is going on. You have the Beatles who are establishing the whole pop thing, and everybody's all into their style of music, and these guys are influenced, of course, by them, and they love their harmonies and their melodies and the things that they're writing, but they're their own musicians. In other words, they're in California trying to put together their own sound, being influenced by the British sound, but they don't realize they're about to create their own sound. And so really the Buffalo Springfield is instrumental, because like in Echo in the Canyon, David Crosby says, we were good, but those guys were better. So Crosby, the Byrds take, like Dylan had done, they take folk and they incorporate electronic. They start playing electrical. They start playing electric guitars. To the folk people, that was heresy. People were freaking out. But the Byrds do it, and they become successful. But then Buffalo Springfield does something that the Byrds don't do. They start to become more, so we were talking about rock and roll woman, and some of their songs are so complex. The guitars battling against each other, their harmonies, the arrangements. Now they're doing stuff that the Byrds weren't doing. I mean, they're taking what the Byrds, and things are happening so fast, you know. So like you've got the Beatles stuff, and then you've got the Byrds stuff, and now you've got the Buffalo Springfield, and it's all happening down in the Laurel Canyon. All these bands are listening to each other, talking to each other, playing, you know, things, and saying, "What do you think about this? What do you think about that?" And so they're all just kind of learning as they're going. So really, and you add to it, kind of, there's the mirror to our times now. You're having a great upheaval socially, culturally, in what's happening with Vietnam and the hippie movement and civil rights, and so these guys are also beginning to talk about what's going on. You know, for what it's worth, really, for what it's worth, is saying what's going on, what's happening. Yeah. You know, why is these things happening? What do we do about it? So you've got people who they're not considering themselves socialists or historians or cultural knowledgeable people. They're just saying, we're just responding to what's happening. Right. You know, we're just writing things, seeing things happening, go, well, what's that? Why is that? Why this? So how did they know that would just reverberate through the cult to the country? But of course, it's speaking to the younger generation, because that's the people who are going to listen to them, because at that point, the establishment, the older people would have thought, that's that crazy, you know, rock and roll stuff, you know.
Right. Well, that's the interesting thing too, is that in the 60s, but I guess primarily in the 70s, that the concept of retail and music, the youth was so drawn to it, and so they became more of the cultural perspective on what's important, because they were consuming so much. So I mean, like, music sales were just blowing up year after year after year, because more and more people were getting into it, more and more artists were coming out, sure, but it was kind of the beginnings of the youth kind of directing the market, you know, because it was them buying the albums that were important. You know, you wanted to invest. It wasn't like streaming. It wasn't like YouTube, where it was free and you can enjoy it if you can find it for free and with an ad on it or something like that. Well, no, at that point you had to find it and buy it, and it became something worth investing in, and that's why the sales just continued to climb. I mean, like crazy, particularly in the 70s, but it started in the mid 60s and just kept going higher and higher, and that's well, because let's see, their first album came out in 64, I think. Let me see.
You're talking about Buffalo Springfield?
Yeah.
66.
Yeah. So 66, and then, so I guess they were in order: 66, 67, 68. And so at that point, I mean, where were the Beatles? The Beatles would have been already at Help. Would they already be done with Help?
They're Rubber Soul and Revolver heading to Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah. Well, and then once you get to this album, Buffalo Springfield Again, I mean, to me, this is kind of the folk rock response to Sgt. Pepper. It's like, it's not, it doesn't have, I mean, there are some really complicated, in-depth, you know, crazy songs on here, but to me, it's a response to it's almost like they knew what they were doing, taking folk chords and folk progressions, but putting them through electric, adding these weird effects, adding these weird noises, psychedelic noises, and creating this psychedelic folk rock group. But then you get the Beatles, you know, doing really good, solid rock, pop rock, and then you get to Sgt. Pepper, and you get this, you know, psychedelic new approach.
Operatic almost, epic type stuff.
Yes, very epic, complicated. It's a studio album. It's all studio. Album. It's a total concept album. And so with this one, I mean, you get Mr. Soul, which is a very, you know, high energy, kind of psychedelic, but it's just like it's a gritty rock song. Yeah, it's not very bulky. That's Neil's gritty electric coming out, and that's what's awesome about Springfield. If you are a Neil Young fan, is you can tell, you know, Stephen Still's guitar versus Young's guitar.
Oh yeah.
And traditionally, in how they recorded, if I'm not mistaken, I need to figure out a better way to do this thing. most of the time it would be Stephen Stills doing the acoustic portions and Neil would do the electric portions. Like in the song Bluebird, which is at the end of the first half of Buffalo Springfield again. I love the ending of that song because I mean the electric guitar is just so high energy and intense, but then you have these really like complicated acoustic guitar, even banjo at sometimes, and they, like what you were saying before, they battle back and forth, and like that's a cool thing of it's cohesion. You feel like the band, they're all at their best, and that's the cool thing about like the Beatles is every time you would listen to the Beatles, that's what made their production so phenomenal. Is every piece had its own unique part to it. There wasn't, they always tried to stay on that cutting edge. And Buffalo Springfield was the same mindset, and you have these phenomenal musicians trying to be competitive with another set of phenomenal musicians. You're just going to get better and better, But yeah, I mean, this album, like, I guess, like you could compare some of these songs to Sgt. Pepper, like Expecting to Fly. To me, that one and Broken Arrow are very much kind of, because they're both Neil Young's, they're primarily Neil Young songs. In fact, Neil Young did Expecting to Fly primarily by himself.
Yeah, it was pretty much his.
Yeah, well, that was the beginning of them kind of unfolding. Yeah, because they. And their touring, I know they had a lot of drug charges. The bassist, I know Palmer got caught with drugs. It doesn't list what it is, but it gets caught with something like 2 or 3 times, and then he gets taken back to Canada at one point. And so that's why he drops off, I think, after the second album. And Neil and Stephen Stills just had big personalities and wanted to steer the ship, and I just think they couldn't have that balance. They never found it. And who knows, maybe Palmer was a good offset because he knew Neil, but he also knew Stephen. But anyways, Expecting to Fly and Broken Arrow, I feel like are good. They're good tracks to compare to like A Day in the Life. Long, like an epic song. It's got an intro, it's got an outro that's very epic and intense, and then the lyrics. Every time they come in, it's an important statement. I mean, like Expecting to Fly is a really raw, like approach to a love relationship of one person not being communicative and saying how much they would love them, and then realizing that I don't know. I mean, it's up to interpretation, but it's a very intense love ballad of your expectations of love and what it means and what you get from one another. But that one in Broken Arrow, I mean, Broken Arrow has like 6 or 7 parts to it.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
It has like the opening of Mr. Soul, and then it fades into the actual Broken Arrow song of Neil Young, and then into like carnival noises, and then back to the Broken Arrow, and but that was like the test. That was the that's why I love music. I love to find the alternative, the weird approach to a song, because I don't want to expect it. I like change. I like the unexpected. And so I just feel like that's why I've always loved this album. That's why I own this album, is because that's what a lot of this is like a lot of songs, they're hard to expect what's coming. It's not like a little doo-wop little ditty that they do a measure and they just keep repeating it because it's commercial. It meets the pop formula or something. It was just very expressive and different. That was the whole get. That's the awesome thing about Laurel Canyon. You had all these musicians just constantly around each other, trying to get that new sound.
I think that's what you just said. I was thinking about just now is that these guys, the Springfield and all the other players that are around them, Jackson Browne and the Byrds, David Crosby, and all these different people, they're sharing and experimenting with music and drugs, but they're also branching out. So in other words, I didn't think of that. They're trying this. Did you hear this? What do you think about this? And so they're playing off of each other so much, but they just also happen to be pretty competent musicians. So they haven't yet arrived. They haven't become Stephen Stills or Neil Young. They're just guys playing guitars and making music and writing songs. At the same time, they're listening to the Beatles. Now let's also remember there wasn't FM radio. They weren't hearing the songs as they came out. They would hear them from the 45s and the albums are the one or two stations that would play. What would they play? The singles. They wouldn't spin a whole record. They'd say, oh, this is the single from the Beatles. This is the single from whoever. So they're listening to these songs and saying, okay, wow, well, I want to hear that album. What's that album? And then they get the album, they start listening to it. Well, they had to have sat around and listened to it together and said, you hear what they said? Look what they're doing. Let's try that. Let's do this. Let's do that. So I think exactly like what you're just saying is, it's Neil primarily, but I'm sure it's the rest of the band, but I think it's predominantly Neil. He's like, you know what? I think we can respond to Sgt. Pepper. I think we can make songs like that because we're sharing enough, we're talking enough about it. We know how to make music. They're getting better. Think about it, in 3 albums, they're getting to by the 3rd album, they're able to do Expecting to Fly and Broken Arrow. That's quite an acceleration of their understanding of the studio and how to use instruments and how to use the equipment. And so they cut Expecting to Fly and Broken Arrow, which I'm sure some people are like, what is that? Why are you making that? Because it's very unusual, it's different, but it's very similar to some of the style of Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. And let's also remember, by this point, the Beatles they're not playing live anymore. They're not doing concerts. Yeah. They're strictly studio. Whereas what are the Buffalo Springfield doing? They're live. They're performing. But not only they're performing, they're also jamming with other musicians and other bands, and they're so it's like that's where their acceleration comes from, right? It's almost like they were able to catch up to a certain extent to what the Beatles were doing. The Beatles were always setting the tone or the pace, but all of a sudden from the West Coast, all these bands began to just kick out all this music, and before you know it, their sound is just as vital and just as influential in America as the Beatles were. Not that the Beatles they've lost it yet. They're still the Beatles. In other words, they've arrived at a level where people are going to listen to them no matter what. Yeah. But now these guys from the West Coast, the Beach Boys, you can throw them in there too. They're all kicking out albums that are like, whoa, what are you doing? What are they doing? Yeah.
Well, it's like, that's just saying the nature of competition and being a good to decent musician, and you're listening to the Beatles, change the landscape of music every album. It's like they just play that guitar backwards. Like, what is that instrument? What is that sound?
How do they do that?
Yeah, and just to be like, because I can imagine, especially someone like Neil Young being blown away by that, because he was a career musician. I mean, that was his life. As soon as he was 18, I think, is when he tried to start that Squire group, and he tried to do a solo career and it didn't work out. And then he started playing for the Manovers with Rick James. And then, he was constantly ready for the mantle of the musician. But then you see these 4 dudes over in the UK just dominating. And not just out of making satisfying music, but you see it in the media of the crowds, of the fact that, like what you just said, by the time Buffalo Springfield was on TV shows performing live and getting their first big breaks and stuff, the Beatles had already powered down and were over touring. It's like by the mid-'60s when they were ramping up, the Beatles were like, all right, we've had our taste of that intense, fame of people thinking they know us and they don't. We're just trying to make this content and enjoy it, because that's what Paul and John say, like in interviews, is they just started it because they liked music, they liked rock music, Little Richard and Elvis and yada yada, and they thought it would be a good little gig, and then it started to just pick up more and more momentum. But then you have this super dedicated person like Neil Young, who kind of in the same field, but he went through multiple bands. So it was like, I know I'm going to figure this out eventually, and I think that's a big acceleration, is for someone that takes it so seriously like him or Stephen Stills, that you see the Beatles, take away the touring aspect, and you're like, what? That's crazy. That'd be crazy. And then they pump out, Sgt. Pepper and then the White Album, all these crazy things where it's like, oh my God, the music never stopped. They just took a different approach.
But isn't that also kind of like the difference between the rock and roll and the folk? Like that folk element that Neil Young sort of never departs from, and saying like he wants the audience interaction. He wants, like there is the music component, but then there's also the I want you to hear these lyrics. I want you to feel, these songs and to feel this.
I think in terms
momentum.
of his evolution, it was like his pacing in his career, like, because this album is proof of it. I mean, he's got Mr. Soul, Expecting to Fly, and Broken Arrow, which are like really crazy songs, and then all of his electric contributions to any of the other ones. But like, it's a step up from the last album. This is only their second album, and then by the third album, One More Time Around, or what is the last one called?
Last Time Around.
Let me see. Do you have it, Scott?
Last Time Around.
You have, Questions and I Am a Child. Like, it's much more folky. They go back into folky.
Bluebird, I think, too.
No, Bluebird's on.
Bluebird's on that one too.
Here, let me see. Yeah, Last Time Around, you have On the Way Home, which you said that's a cover. Oh no, that Neil Young wrote it.
Springfield covers it, but then Neil does it later. He keeps it as a repertoire song.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this one's got, it's just, to me, this album to me is almost like, it's not like the Doors' last album when you don't have Morrison on it, but it kind of is, because you don't have there's no pure direction. There's no like leader in this last album. It's like Neil, I think before this album even came out, he had quit, and he had quit the day of they were supposed to debut on the Sullivan Show.
Oh, Carson.
It was Carson.
Johnny Carson.
And and they were supposed to go, and then was it when they got off the plane or before they got on it? He walks out and says, "I'm done. I'm not doing it."
Yeah.
And
which pulls the plug on the band too.
Yeah. And so this album is just kind of like the cleanup of what they had in store already. And so Fear Rate does a few songs that Neil wrote. But to me, this is the chance for you to kind of notice how good Fury is in his own right, because like the song "Kind Woman," like that's a phenomenal song. Like, it's a very like intense, or it's not intense, it's just a very strong like love ballad. And then he plays a guitar on it, and that steel guitar is so like it's so good.
Well, it's a good point you're making, because Fury and Messina go on to be a part of a very influential folkish pop type bands, which is Poco and Loggins and Messina, who make a lot of that same music. They're showing their harmonies and their ability to do those songs, which are different from Neil and Stills.
Can you move that a little closer to you?
Better?
Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to point out too is, like you were saying about how the Beatles had decided to back away from live touring, but when you look at the lyrics of Broken Arrow, Neil says the lights turned on and the curtain fell down, and when it was all over, it felt like a dream. They stood at the stage door and begged for a scream. The agents had paid for the black limousine that waited outside in the rain. Did you see them? Did you see them? Did you see them in the river? They were there to wave to you. So it's almost like he's saying, we've seen all that. I mean, we've seen the limos, we've seen the people screaming and yelling for us, and they're waiting for us to go. And did you see all that? Because I'm done with it.
Right.
It's Broken Arrow. It's it's laying there broken on the side of the creek. I mean, he's making his observation that I want to do something else, and I don't want people screaming and chasing me like a pop star.
Right. Well, that's what I was saying. Like, I think he was one of those people that took the cue from the Beatles of, like, when the Beatles stopped touring, some people had their own little selfish like offense to it. It'd be like, that's crazy. Who would think to do that? Why would you do that? But he's lived it. He's gotten to that point where he's had a taste of it, and then he's watched them intensely. And like, I could see if I ever get that big, like, I don't want that. Like, I want my art. I want it to be successful, but I don't want it to override me. I don't want it to change what I want to be.
Yeah, he still wanted to be live, but he wanted to do it his way.
Yeah,
he didn't want to have to follow the.
But how many of those groups, when they got that big, actually kept touring and doing live music anyway? Because the Beach Boys didn't. I mean, I guess just the Rolling Stones continued to tour when they were
the big bands, the most
like the ones that got that uber famous, like they all stopped.
Well, I feel like a lot of the ones, I mean, yeah, there were the majority of them that either had, internal turmoil or, like Neil, they just wanted to break off and do their own thing. Or even like people like Bowie, where like he started off in bands. He was a saxophonist and then was a backup singer and then became the singer for, I forget that band. It's kind of like a 50s doo-wop kind of group, whatever. But totally not his style. But that was the beginnings. And then as soon as he had a chance to do his own thing, it was just totally different. But he took the influence from the Beatles of kind of same thing. Sgt. Pepper, That Day in the Life, like Space Oddity was his first big single on his first album, and that was. I mean, it's very much like a day in the life, how it's, it has that big intro, has that crazy ending, and it has a really good story. And even in that song, it has parallel lines, of what shirt do you wear, I think is used in both, I think. And he's openly admitted, that was a big influence. But, he was the one kind of breaking out of that expected music industry mold of like, I don't need to have a producer or like a certain producer. I don't need to have a full band, because you talk about, like Dave Bowie, it was like a revolving door, the people that he would play with, because he always wanted to be on the cutting edge, that music renaissance,
Well, and I think that actually when you pointed out just now, but also in relation to the Buffalo Springfield, one of the big things you see happening from Laurel Canyon and the West Coast is that these guys are figuring out, hey, we can write our own ticket. We can be ourselves. We can do what we want to do the way we want to do it, and they'll pay us. We don't have to follow the corporate model. We don't have to follow like you remember like the movie that Thing You Do, where the record company or the producers or the studio tells you this is what you wear, this is how you act, this is the style you do, and you play what we tell you. So when the West Coast blows up and these guys are coming out of there, all those bands that coming from Laurel Canyon, they're doing what they want to do. They're dressing like they want to dress. They dance like they want to dance. Yeah. Like what pops in my head is like the Mamas and the Papas. You talk about an eclectic looking group of people. They're just dancing crazy, dressed like hippies. And they don't, in other words, people didn't do that back then. Yeah. Just that alone would have freaked people out.
Oh, but that was like the awesome kind of energy of that time and place, is that everybody was kind of on that cutting edge of the new sound. Everyone was trying to figure out what was next. And we can talk about the Doors, how Elektra Records gave them a shot because they saw them performing, and they were performing, some stuff that was like good rock that most of the time was composed primarily by Robbie Krieger. It was just good rock and roll, like Light My Fire. That was his song. He wrote it, and it was just a good little rock song that was catchy. Well, that would get them in the door, but then they had all these weird songs that were primarily poetry from Morrison. And then Morrison being an inexperienced vocalist, sometimes he wouldn't even face the crowd when they would perform. He would face the band and sing, and he was working his way up. That wasn't his world. He was a heavy artist because he was in film school, but he would write so much, and that was never the goal, to be a musical lead or the singer. But then you hit Elektra Records, and I forget his first name, but I know his last name is Rothschild. The producer sees them, I think at Whiskey Go Go, doing a night, and then gives them a shot. Wants to give them a record because they have that weird dynamic to them of like, that's not. Like I was saying before, I didn't know what to expect when they played, and like that was satisfying, especially to a producer at that point who was over the doo-wop, the slow love rock, or the expected like Chuck Berry covers or whatever, But here's this like weird kind of like, it's poetry. It's very like hardline poetry, and then you had other musicians that were phenomenal. Raymond Mazarek's piano playing was crazy. Their drummer, I'm blanking on his name, but he was a career studio jazz drummer, and he was just phenomenal. And you have Robbie Krieger, who when they started the Doors, he was only 6 months into playing the guitar, And the only time he never used a pick. He would only use his fingers and a bottleneck slide, which a bottleneck slide is literally the top part of a wine bottle that they cut off and then polish off, and then that's what he's using. That's all he would ever use. And so, but they had that perspective of like, I appreciate the old music. We love Elvis and yada yada, but like, let's make something different. We don't want to hear the same stuff. And that was one of those things where, I mean, this is an opinion of mine, but Elektra Records saw them, saw how odd they were, of an oddity, and then they wanted to give them a shot, and then they proved themselves, and then just kept that weird train rolling, But that was the awesome energy of like that time, is there was so much potential, because there wasn't, there was only a certain amount of rock, groups or rock types. And like what we were talking about before was Buffalo Springfield. To some people, playing folky music with an electric guitar, that was offensive. That was blasphemous. What are you doing? But then you look at the Beatles. I mean, that's what they're doing. I mean, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Those are folk chords on an electric guitar. And eventually you get Dylan, going electric, which I turned a lot more people on to that, because this phenomenal icon, this writer, singer icon, he's doing that now. It was a big deal. But that's why I love this era, is because there's just so much massive potential, because there was so much undone yet that we see now. I mean, this is 50 plus years ago, but they had no idea what would lie ahead in the terms of rock and roll, of it becoming such a spectacle. Of when you show up, you don't just show up and play. You have to have lights and visuals and blah blah blah. Or it's not just the typical chords. It's like you learn the heavier rock or grunge and like all this other stuff that ushers in decade after decade prior to that. But that's why I love the 60s and the early 70s, because you can find the beginnings of almost any type of music like in that. And Buffalo Springfield is just awesome because it's the beginning. I mean, particularly for like someone like Neil Young, it's the beginning of their mass exposure and the trajectory of their career. Of like Neil Young going from, if I'm not correct me, but he goes from this to a solo album, right? And then it's Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
I think he does. He does Neil Young, and he does Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. He plays with the Crazy Horse too.
Crazy Horse, okay.
And then he starts to hang out with them again, because they approach him and ask him if he wants to join them. But he's still, he's going. He's playing.
Well, and that was the. I guess my timing's off. You're right, because it goes Neil Young, Crazy Horse, Everybody Knows It's Nowhere, and then because Kent State happened,
yes,
69. And then that's when they get together. That's when they get back together for Ohio, which is a phenomenal song. That song is so crazy. And I mean, that's how. Maybe we should kind of wrap up the topic of Buffalo Springfield with this, because that's kind of the last time they get together, partially because Bruce Palmer is far and away. He's in Canada. And they've all moved on to their own independent stuff. They've proven themselves in their last albums. And then, something major political happens. And for anybody who's listening that doesn't know what we're referencing when we talk about Kent State, was it 6? Was it 6? 5? 4? 4 dead in Ohio. That's the chorus. 4 students at Kent State were murdered during a peaceful protest.
Yeah, National
Guard shot them. And so after that happened, Neil Young, the night of, wrote the lyrics to Ohio, and then they got together and made the single Ohio, which is phenomenal. I mean, his guitar solo on it is just so it's so, I don't want to say it's electric, because it literally is electric, but it's like it's got a lot of energy in it. The feeling, it's almost palpable. It's like, like there's certain songs that you listen to where like, man, the guitarist, like, he wrote the song too. Like, you can tell that they're playing it, because it's almost like they're translating their feelings into chords. They're translating how they feel, and to make it palpable so you understand. And that song is just so, it's like you feel like a high energy frustration from it, and it's very good. And then they have their album, the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young album, and then they do a live album too. And that was basically it. They'd hinted at getting the original Buffalo Springfield lineup together. And Neil Young, I think, was the kind of the one that was not in line. Like, I guess the timing, because he's literally nonstop at what he's doing, and he didn't do it. And then I think it was Fure and Palmer died like early 2000s, and the following year they did like a tribute and played together one last time.
Or it was because they didn't want to do it Neil's way.
Yeah, yeah, very, very possible.
Yeah.
Wikipedia says they did a reunion tour in 2011.
Okay. Yeah.
Sans Young.
Without
Young.
But yeah, I'm pretty sure
a few shows, I guess.
I'm pretty sure at some point in the early 2000s, when two of the members passed away, like in the same year, or maybe it was preceding years. Then the year after that, then they finally did something, but it was just like a little pop-up thing. But yeah, it's very interesting. And I mean, we can obviously have our own discussion about Neil Young, but the beginning of Buffalo Springfield is just it's that start. I just love the how it goes from, I mean, even for what it's worth, I don't want to call that a not a simple song, but just like a folk rock song, because it's very abnormal. I mean, just the tone, the one pluck of that really vibrant guitar in the background.
Because I think it's Stills that writes for what it's worth. I don't think Young wrote it though.
No,
correct.
But that's why that guitar. That's why I wanted to break in on what you're saying. That it shows more Stills influence, but it begins to show their interest in and their wanting to express what's happening. Because it's almost prophetic. I mean, because you can listen to it today and it still applies to today, what's going on, there's a man with a gun over there telling me I've got to beware. So they're capturing that feeling of anxiety and paranoia and confusion.
Yeah. Well, that's actually one of my favorite parts of that song is when they tell that line, the paranoia strikes deep, and you have Neil Young doing it really because he makes, again, that palpable guitar vibe sound that you do, that like it's uncomfortable. It's like, it's like that. I mean, to me as a music lover, and like I said before, wanting to find alternative, like finding different approaches to music or a story or a poem or whatever expression, and not only having good dialect or good lyrics in it, but having the instruments playing a role in setting the feeling, setting that, like, I mean, like when a drummer is playing nothing but the toms and the bass, and it's like, that's like that, it's like, it's almost tribal. It's like that high energy, like, but with the electric guitar, like the way the Buffalo Springfield uses it, particularly, and for what it's worth, I mean, that's what I think makes that song so stellar and relatable to a lot of people. Is it's not just good writing. You have the accompaniment of this instrument setting the tone of the feelings behind the words. And I think any song at all, but I mean, any huge song that will stand the test of time, that's what it does. That's what it achieves, is it makes those feelings understood to the listener. And like we've talked about a lot, whenever, pressure makes a diamond. So, I mean, I say that a lot with artists, like whenever they're in a hard place in life, a lot of times it's when they'll churn out some of their best work. And I think it's because they're processing so much, there's so much on their mind. And when it comes to exuding it, expressing themselves through their form of artwork, through an instrument or writing or whatever, or both, like someone like George Harrison is going to write it and then play it. Like All Things Must Pass. I mean, that was just like a huge culmination, because there's so much happening. The Beatles breaking up, his divorce, his mom passing away, not knowing what the future holds, and not knowing where he lies in the landscape of the music industry, but knowing he's worked on enough stuff in the background. That wasn't enough for the Beatles, but now that he's underneath all this pressure, I mean, he buckled down, and inside of that year of late 1969 through the later half of the 1970s, he finishes or 1970, not 1970s. They finished All Things Must Pass, and that's just like it's a phenomenal album. But he was again underneath so much pressure. Or What's Going On, and What's Going On, you have his Marvin Gaye's brother had just gotten back from Vietnam, and he saw how he was received. He was on the cusp of divorce with his wife, who was the eldest sister of Berry Gordy, who was the lead producer of Motown. You had the Kent State thing going on, so he didn't know, like, there was so much going on. Oh, and Tammy Tramiel passed away from brain cancer, and he said that he wasn't going to do a duet with anyone ever again. He was down, and on top of that,
and then he was in drugs at that time too.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, and also, we talk about him as a pop star artist. He a lot of stuff was written for him, in the 60s. But at that point, he wanted to turn out his perspective. That's when a majority of What's Going On was written by him. And but that's what I'm talking about, is those critical moments. You take away the comfort from a really creative person, and you get them to come to new terms with their reality or society or a relationship or whatever, and you can churn out some really unique music because of that pressure. Because it's almost, I imagine it has to come out of some biological survival thing, that when you feel uncomfortable, you're at your best, because you have heightened senses because you don't know what's coming next. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how it exactly goes, but there's this philosopher I listen to, Peter Rollins. He says that it's like an Irish saying or something like that, where an artist is someone who can kind of put language to their bleeding. And so what we really want them to keep doing is keep bleeding. Yeah. Like they express it in some way, or they can give language to people's hurts and people's pains. And so we really need that artist to keep going through all of those things, so that we could get their language, or we can get that that catharsis that happens for the community. But it's this individual's pain or life that they're going through, but the way that they express and the way that they talk about it is through art. And so that's what sort of keeps that cycle going. But I always like that sort of perspective on how artists just naturally they go through their emotions, and they'll write a song about their individual heartache or something like that, and then you have this great song that might come from that, or kind of an album or something that outflows just from them going through that pain.
Yeah, I think that's what you see again when you compare the West Coast music to the Beatles being in the forefront of the British invasion. And what they were doing, especially after they've gone to the studios, they're writing things that are very introspective, right? They're writing things that are pertain to them. They're making some observations about the culture, but they're not necessarily writing about the things that are happening at the minute that we see what's happening in the West Coast. What I'm saying is the Buffalo Springfield and people on the West Coast, they wrote stuff and did things that the Beatles wouldn't do or couldn't do. I mean, just as the Beatles were doing things they couldn't do, they were doing things the Beatles couldn't do. The Beatles didn't write anything like For What It's Worth or Ohio, which comes a little bit later, but it reflects like the quote he was saying, Neil and their whole, the intensity, the blood coming through their music, that sound you hear in Neil's guitar, that almost, which, when you see parodies of rock guitarists, they're trying to, or blues guitarists, they can make it cry, you can make it sing. Well, Neil had this sound that he makes to that guitar that you're like, what is that? How does he do that? But it has almost like a live sound to it. It's living, like there's something alive in that music. But I think part of it is they're so impacted by the things they're seeing in their culture and what's happening to their generation, the college students, the kids that are going to Vietnam. And like you said, like Marvin Gaye, he's being impacted now. He's seeing things happening. They're watching people coming back from Nam going, man, what is wrong with you? He's like, well, you don't know what I've seen, the things what's going on over there. And so, but the Buffalo Springfield, specifically, Neil and Stephen Stills, but all those guys and the bands that were around them and the people that would become very influential in writing, and like Jackson Browne and Roger McGowan from the Byrds, and these guys they're writing what they see. It's happening to the people around them, and they're making observations, but they're making music at the same time. And so it's kind of a mesh of a lot of things going on, where the Beatles have said, you know what, we've been out there, we've done it live, we're the band right now, so we retreat to the studio and we're just going to compose our music. They happen to be able to do it very well. They were doing it great by that point. But to me, when you look at it from that perspective, they're making music from a totally different perspective than what they're doing on the West Coast.
Yeah.
Although they're being influenced by what the Beatles are doing, they're also doing something that's different.
Yeah.
And they're relating to things and writing about things that before you wouldn't do that. Well, like Marvin Gaye, when he does What's Going On, you don't make an album about social issues. You don't.
Yeah, it doesn't.
You're not.
It's not the pop.
That's not what they want. They need your finger popping pop songs. You got to make a song where everybody wants to sing it. He's like, no, I'm going to sing about what I feel and what I see happening, which gives what goes on a similar feeling to me as some of the songs you see coming out of the West Coast that are about about what's happening in the culture, in the society, to the people.
Criticism.
Yes, criticism, and just an outcry of what's going on. What are we supposed to do about that?
Yeah.
Who is doing something about it?
Well, I feel like really what you're touching on is both kind of have that outcry of, am I the only one seeing this? Like, is this right? And it's like, is everybody else okay with this? Or is this just kind of like, we got to talk about it? Because nowadays it's like with media being so vast, everything. You want to look into the current state of wildfires in a small county, you can look it up like that. But at that point, I just feel like, especially as a young person who doesn't want to conform to what the previous generation was told to do, and yada yada, this is going to be your life and your career life, that they wanted to just talk about it. They wanted to not just accept it, but what is this? Are y'all all okay with this? Because I feel like that's why it's worthwhile. And we can. I want to do Marvin Gaye as a separate episode, but that's another interesting thing, is those labels starting to take those chances of letting the artist be a little more expressive, be more open about it. And that varies. That's another topic for another day. But how production labels would vary how they would handle different types of artists. How would they try and mitigate those feelings of like, no, that's not marketable, so you're not going to talk about it? Or would they give him a chance? Like with Marvin Gaye, he he was given a shot. Like, they didn't want to do it, but they gave him a shot on what's going on. And in other ones that just full-fledged, just do what you want. Like the Beatles, like they got to a point where they could just write almost about anything in their last few years, because they weren't marketing it, they weren't touring it. If the record sold, then we're good. And then they had become their own producers. By the time they made Apple Records, who was going to tell them what to do except George Martin? And if anything, to me, that was almost like a suggestion. It was like a team agreement, but like they were all apt to grow and grow conceptually. That it's not just going to talk about love and yada yada, although they did throughout their entire career, but they got more accurate in what they were talking about. And now more so once they stem out from each other in their solo careers, especially John, they get very precise about how they want to criticize things and stuff like that.
But they also had limited life experience too at the beginning.
Oh, sure. Exactly.
So all of the things that they were, the simple songs and a lot of covers, right? When they were sort of cutting their teeth and getting used to playing live and all that, it was all covers that they sort of blended and made their own things. And then as they went through the albums, it was like, oh, we have seen a lot of the world, we have seen a lot of our own suffering, and they've been in like real love relationships after that.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Well, and that became a key point to why they splintered and why they became such an independent force individually, is because they wanted that culture to grow, their musical understanding of going to Jamaica and listening to those artists, going to India, going to Africa, going to anywhere they fancied, honestly, probably, to pick up a new sound, to find a new sound. Because I don't remember who said this quote, but any new sound is just a sound on a new instrument from another country or something like that. I can't remember who said that, but it's like it's like obla di obla da. They got that phrase from someone they met, I think, in Jamaica. That's what the guy would say, and they just liked it so much that they wanted to turn it into a song. And or I don't know. There's a lot of stuff, and we can go
just
down that road.
appropriation everywhere they went.
Well, I just call it appreciation. I would call it appreciation because I like, because like even me and like our group, there's times where I'll want to play a song that I know I'm playing in the stylings of like an older 60s song or whatever, but I'll pick up the tempo, and add a grittier sound to it or something to it. And all of a sudden it's very hard to tell that I'm riffing off of a song from the 60s. Because it's just harder to tell. Like, like the Portugal the Man song, Feel It Still, their biggest song, whatever, they gave writing credits to, what was the band's group? It was a female trio or whatever, but it's the group that did, Mr. Postman, Please Mr. Postman.
The Marvelettes?
Yeah. So they gave them writing credits because the cadence or the timing is, yes, it's very much, it's the same.
It is a very interesting cadence.
Well, it's not the same, but it's super close. Yeah. But John Gorley knew that that's where he got it from. He wanted to take that like basic kind of melody, change it, make it a little more complicated, and then change it up and move on. This would be a great topic for another day, but like Nirvana, like Kurt Cobain, when it came to music composure and lyricism, that's what he would always address the group with, is don't make it too complicated. Literally his quote was like, keep it like a nursery rhyme, like keep it really simple. And we'll build off from there. But yeah, I don't know. That's why Buffalo Springfield or Neil Young and Paul McCartney and I don't know, there's a ton of people, but that's why I'm super drawn to those musical personalities, is because like me, they want the alternative. They appreciate it, and then they kind of move on because they're like, well, what else is out there? Because it's infinite. Who's going to make the next sound? And that hyper competitive, environment of Laurel Canyon and just the up and come, like I was saying, the marketability of music and the increase and people buying music, it just ramped up that hyper sense of well, who's next, who's gonna be the next sound, and everybody competing with each other and yada yada. But yeah, very interesting. But yeah, if you haven't listened to Buffalo Springfield, I would definitely give them a try, because they're a lot of beginnings of early rock and roll that, you can't replicate it, because then you'd be plagiarizing them. So you need to go check them out, because it's a very different approach to rock. And I guess it's a very clean, well-produced folk rock psychedelic album from the early 60s that, you can find it replicated in the same type of sense, but it'll never be written down like it is in this. So I would check it out. All right.
Thank you for listening. For more episodes, visit our website, musicmythpodcast.com, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Goodbye.